There's a specific kind of silence that exists only in the seconds right after a phone call ends, after someone has said something that rearranges your entire understanding of your own life, and the line goes dead, and you're left standing there holding a phone that suddenly feels heavier than it did 30 seconds ago. I know that silence intimately. I've lived inside it. And I think if I'm honest, I've spent most of my adult life trying to find my way back out of it. I want to tell you about that silence, and about the strange, unexpected place I eventually found my way through it. A crime saga about a Miami drug empire, a hidden son, a contract killer torn between vengeance and love, and a family fractured by secrets its patriarch took to his grave. I didn't expect a story about cartels and betrayal to teach me anything about my own quiet, unglamorous grief, but it did, and I want to walk you through exactly how. I was 26 years old on a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as significant, that slides by anonymously between the errands and the emails, and the small, forgettable frictions of an ordinary week. I was sitting in my apartment, halfway through reheating leftovers, when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the kind of detail that only matters in retrospect. If I hadn't answered, I would have gone on for who knows how much longer, believing the story I'd built for myself, the comfortable, familiar story of a father who simply wasn't around, wasn't capable, wasn't built for the responsibility of a child. A flat, uncomplicated absence. I had made peace with that story. It was small enough to carry. But I answered. A woman's voice, calm and procedural, asked to confirm my identity. She used phrases like estate proceedings and beneficiary designation and next of kin. And none of those words landed correctly in my brain, because I didn't know anyone whose death would require that kind of language. I didn't know anyone with an estate large enough to need an attorney's careful phrasing. I think you have the wrong person, I told her, already reaching to end the call. And then she said a name. A single name, spoken plainly, the way you'd read an item off a grocery list, and it detonated something in my chest that had been sitting quietly, dormant, since I was 9 years old. It was my father's name. A name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in 17 years. A name my mother had once hissed at her sister in the middle of an argument I wasn't supposed to be listening to, before catching herself, going pale, and never mentioning it again. A name that existed in my childhood only as a shape-shifting absence, sometimes a soldier, sometimes a musician, sometimes just a blank space I filled in with whatever fantasy made the emptiness that week. I didn't have a real memory of him. Not one. I had constructed an entire childhood mythology instead, the way children do when the truth is too quiet and too painful to sit with, building elaborate, hopeful stories to explain why someone who was supposed to love you simply wasn't there. It's a strange kind of magic trick, the human mind's ability to protect itself from an unbearable truth by manufacturing a bearable lie and believing it so completely that it becomes indistinguishable from memory. That Tuesday, the magic trick ended. I flew down for the reading of the will, because curiosity outweighs dignity almost every time, and because some small, foolish, hopeful part of me thought this might finally be the moment I understood. Maybe there'd be a letter. Maybe there'd be an explanation, some scrap of context that would let me finally exhale a breath I'd been holding since childhood. What I found instead was a family, a real one. A woman who was not my mother, sitting rigid in a leather chair like she was bracing for an earthquake. 2. Brothers twins, as it turned out, who looked at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd broken into your house and rearranged the furniture. And beneath all of it, slowly revealing itself through the lawyer's careful, clinical language, the outline of a life my father had built that had nothing to do with the version of him I'd invented as a child. He hadn't just been absent, he'd been elsewhere, building something large enough and dangerous enough that grown men in that room changed their posture when certain topics came up. Something that didn't just leave a grieving family behind, it left a vacancy that other people were already circling, because vacancies like that don't stay empty. They get filled, one way or another, by whoever moves fastest and cares least about the wreckage. I sat in that office and understood, for the first time, that I hadn't just lost a father I never had. I had discovered that I was a footnote in someone else's story, the daughter he built into the architecture of his silence, tucked away so completely that even his own sons had no idea I existed until a lawyer's letter forced the truth into daylight. I remember driving away from that meeting with my hands trembling on the steering wheel. Not from grief, because I hadn't earned grief yet. Not really. Not for a man I'd never actually known, but from a very specific, very focused rage. Rage at the unfairness of inheriting the aftershocks of choices I never got to weigh in on. Rage at spending 26 years believing his absence was a referendum on my worth, only to discover it was never about me at all. It was about a world he built that had no architecture for softness, no blueprint for a little girl who just wanted him to show up to a school play. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Inherited pain doesn't check whether you're ready. It doesn't knock. It just arrives, dressed up as an inheritance you never asked for and cannot legally return. I wish I could tell you the months that followed were a clean, cinematic arc of grief followed by growth. They weren't. They were messy in the particular way that real unraveling always is: quiet, unglamorous, invisible to almost everyone around me. I started having dreams where he existed differently. Dreams where he showed up. Dreams where some alternate timeline version of him chose me, chose to be present, chose to make room in his empire for the daughter who existed outside its frame. I'd wake up from those dreams feeling worse than before I fell asleep, because the grief wasn't actually for the man who died, it was for the man who never existed in the first place. The one my subconscious kept trying to resurrect out of pure longing. I started drinking a little more than I should have. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone around me would have flagged. Just enough to blur the edges of the questions circling my head at 2 a.m. Why wasn't I enough? Why build an empire with room for 2 sons and no room for me? What kind of man constructs something that vast and still can't construct space for the child he made along the way? I started resenting people with uncomplicated relationships with their fathers. I'd scroll past a Father's Day post, some caption about a rock or a hero, and feel a hot, ugly jealousy rise in my chest that I was immediately ashamed of, because I knew, logically, it wasn't their fault I'd been dealt a different hand. But knowing something isn't your fault doesn't make the feeling evaporate. It just means you carry the resentment and the guilt about having it, which is its own particular flavor of exhausting. The part I didn't see coming, the part that actually cost me the most, was how it bled into every other relationship in my life. I started testing people before they had the chance to leave me first. I broke up with someone I genuinely loved because he wanted to meet my family, and the idea of explaining any of it, the secret, the fractured siblings, the empire I wanted, no part of felt like more exposure than I could survive. I didn't have boundaries. I want to say that plainly, because it's the piece of this whole story that actually matters. I didn't know how to say, "This hurts me, I need space," without either exploding or vanishing completely. I swung between building walls too high for anyone to climb, and handing myself over entirely to anyone who offered even a flicker of the attention I'd been starved of as a kid. Nobody taught me the middle ground, because the people who were supposed to teach me were either absent or too busy protecting an empire from crumbling to notice a little girl waiting by a punch bowl at a father-daughter dance. It was my therapist who first mentioned it, a woman I'd started seeing after a stretch where I couldn't get out of bed for 3 straight days. I was mid-sentence, describing the whole situation in that flat, worn-down tone you get after you've told a story so many times it's lost its sharp edges, when she interrupted me gently. "There's a series," she said. "Fiction, but it might resonate. A family exactly like this, a hidden child, an empire built on secrets, a woman caught between loyalty and survival. Sometimes seeing yourself in a story gives you language you can't quite find for your own life." I'll be honest, I was skeptical, maybe even a little offended. The idea that a crime saga about a Miami drug empire could hold anything useful about my very real, very specific grief felt almost insulting at first, like she was trivializing what I was carrying by comparing it to entertainment. But she wasn't trivializing it. she was doing something smarter. She understood that fiction, even dramatic, high-stakes, morally complicated fiction can function as a mirror, clear enough to reflect emotional truths we can't look at directly in our own lives. Sometimes the distance of a made-up story is exactly what makes the truth inside it safe enough to actually see. That night, still doubtful, I downloaded it anyway. I told myself I'd read a chapter and move on with my evening. I did not move on with my evening. I read until 4 in the morning. I called out of work the next day and kept reading. The Empire Without a Head. Here's what caught me from the very first pages. The story doesn't open with power. It opens with the sudden, brutal absence of it. A patriarch, the most feared figure in his city's underworld, is simply gone. And everything he spent decades building becomes, overnight, a vacuum. Something other people start circling, because power without a clear inheritance doesn't stay quiet. It fractures, it bleeds. It attracts every predator smart enough to smell an opening. I felt something drop in my stomach reading that setup, because it was structurally identical to my own life, just dressed in different clothes. A powerful figure, gone. A family left holding pieces they never asked to inherit. And then the detail that made me physically set the book down and breathe for a second, the reveal that the patriarch had left behind a secret child. A son the family never knew existed, who arrives in the aftermath of the funeral and is handed, without warning or preparation, an entire legacy he never consented to. I sat with that for a long time, because that was me, dressed differently, a different city, a different gender, a different flavor of danger, but carrying the exact same wound, the child who exists outside the frame of the family portrait, who only learns the shape of their own inheritance once the person responsible for the secret is no longer alive to explain any of it. This character, the outsider son, doesn't get to choose whether he wants the legacy. It's simply handed to him, along with every enemy, every expectation, every target that comes attached to a name he never had the chance to grow into gradually. And watching him navigate the shockwaves of that gave me something I hadn't been able to give myself permission to be angry about my own situation without believing that anger made me ungrateful or dramatic or somehow too much for feeling exactly as much as I felt. Reading his arc, I understood something about my own anger that I hadn't been able to articulate before. It was never really about the money, or even the family dinners I never got invited to. It was about being handed something enormous with zero preparation. About having an inheritance, even just the emotional, invisible kind, not an empire. Just the story of who I came from, thrust into my hands, without anyone ever sitting me down first and saying, "Here's what you're walking into. Here's how to protect yourself inside it." Torn between vengeance and love. If the outsider son's arc cracked something open in me about legacy and preparation, it was a different character entirely, a woman. A professional killer running her own crew of hired operatives who taught me the thing I actually needed most, the cost of never learning where loyalty ends and self-protection begins. She's introduced as someone who has weaponized every part of herself, her intelligence, her beauty, her composure, in service of a job that requires total detachment. And then her crew is hired for an operation against the very empire at the center of the story. And everything goes catastrophically wrong. She loses someone irreplaceable in the fallout, someone she was supposed to protect above all else. That loss isn't distant or abstract in the narrative. It's rendered as personal and searing as any grief I'd ever felt about my own fractured family. She wants revenge after that, a singular, all-consuming need to make someone answer for a loss that reshaped the entire architecture of her life. I understood that impulse on a cellular level. Even though my version of revenge looked nothing like hers, mine looked like silent withdrawal, like cutting people out of my life without explanation, like small, quiet acts of self-protection dressed up as indifference. But the underlying mechanism was identical. Someone took something from me, and some part of me needs the world to feel the size of that loss the way I feel it. Here's where the story did something I genuinely didn't see coming, something that landed harder than almost anything else in the entire saga. She falls for someone connected to the very family she was hired to bring down without realizing, at first, exactly who he is. By the time the truth surfaces, she's already entangled. Loyalty pulling her one direction, love pulling her another, revenge sitting in the middle of it all, like an unpaid debt she still technically owes. I read that section 3 separate times, because that tangled, messy knot of competing loyalties is what the absence of boundaries actually feels like from the inside. Not a clean line you can point to and say, this is where I end and you begin, but a chaotic snarl where love, old wounds, new feelings, and inherited loyalty all twist together until you genuinely cannot tell which thread belongs to which impulse anymore. Her heart doesn't operate cleanly. Nobody's heart operates cleanly. That's precisely why boundaries exist, not because our feelings are wrong or excessive, but because without boundaries, feelings will happily lead us straight into situations that cost us everything, exactly the way hers very nearly did. I thought about every relationship I'd quietly sabotaged. Every time I let someone in too fast because their attention felt like the thing I'd been missing my entire life. Every time I mistook intensity for intimacy, because intensity was the only kind of connection I'd ever witnessed, modeled by the adults around me growing up. Her story wasn't a cautionary tale about organized crime. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't know where your loyalty ends and your own survival begins. Without that line, you don't get to choose your battles. Your battles choose you. What the book actually gave me, I finished all 3 volumes of the saga in about 5 days, staying up too late every single night, dragging myself through work more exhausted than I'd been in months, but somehow lighter too, in a way I couldn't explain to the co-workers who asked why I looked different. Here is what I actually walked away with, and this is the part I most want to talk about, because this is where the story stopped being about crime and drama and quietly became about me. And the reset I didn't know I needed. I realized legacy, whether it's a criminal empire built on secrecy and power, or just the emotional inheritance handed down by an absent parent, doesn't have to dictate the terms of how you move forward from here. The outsider son in the story didn't get a vote in being born into that world, but he still had to decide, scene by scene, choice by choice, who he was going to become inside it. That distinction mattered to me more than I can fully explain. I didn't choose to be my father's secret. I didn't choose the fractured siblings, the years of silence, the empire I never got a tour of. But I got to choose what I did with the knowledge, now that I finally had it. I got to choose whether it kept defining me as the one who wasn't worth staying for, or whether I let it finally illuminate why I'd built the exact walls I'd built and start dismantling them on my own timeline, instead of out of fear. I realized the contract killer's tragedy wasn't that she fell in love with the wrong person. It was that she never learned how to hold love, loyalty, and grief in the same hand without one of them swallowing the other 2 whole. She never learned that you can love someone deeply and still walk away if staying costs you your own survival. She never learned that revenge and healing simply cannot occupy the same space eventually. You have to choose which one you're feeding. Watching her wrestle with that finally gave me the language to admit, out loud, in my therapist's office, that I'd been feeding my resentment for months while starving my own healing, and that it was time to make a different choice. So I did. I started setting actual boundaries after that real, specific, communicated ones, not the extreme wall building I'd relied on for most of my adult life. I called my half-brothers, not to insert myself into an empire I genuinely wanted no part of, not to demand recognition I hadn't earned, but simply to say I exist. I'm not a threat to whatever you've built. I don't need anything from you except an acknowledgement that I'm real. It didn't go perfectly. One of them still doesn't speak to me, and I've made peace with the possibility that he never will. But the other one does now, and we've had 2 dinners together over the last few months. Awkward, careful, occasionally silent dinners, but real ones. And both times I left feeling something inside me loosen slightly, something that had been clenched shut since I was 9 years old, listening through a door I wasn't supposed to be near. I stopped testing the people I love. I started saying, "This hurts me," out loud instead of quietly disappearing. I started recognizing the difference between the loyalty I genuinely owed someone and the loyalty that fear convinced me I owed someone, two very different things that had been fused together inside me for as long as I could remember, indistinguishable, until I finally had a story clear enough to separate them. I won't pretend a street-lit crime saga handed me a tidy 5-step healing plan. It didn't. It's not a self-help book. It's a sprawling, high-stakes saga about power, betrayal, and a family fighting to hold together something that was already fracturing from the inside before anyone admitted it. But that's exactly why it worked on me in a way that direct advice never had. Watching the outsider son and the conflicted killer navigate legacy, loyalty, love, and vengeance in the extreme, dramatized architecture of their world gave me a lens sturdy enough to finally examine the much quieter, much less cinematic version of the same struggle happening inside my own ordinary life. Fiction has this strange, specific power. It shows you the shape of your own wound from a safe enough distance that you can actually look directly at it instead of flinching away, the way you might if someone asked you to examine it head-on in your own unfiltered story. Why stories like this work on us? I've thought a lot, since finishing that saga, about why fiction, especially fiction, this dramatic, this high stakes, this far removed from my actual daily life, managed to unlock something that months of direct reflection hadn't touched. I think it's because pain, examined directly, is almost unbearable. When you sit down and try to think clearly and rationally about your own worst wound, the absent parent, the family that fractured before you even understood what was breaking, the years spent building walls instead of learning boundaries, your brain does everything it can to protect you from actually looking at it. You minimize, you rationalize, you tell yourself it wasn't that bad, or that you should be over it by now, or that other people have it so much worse that your pain doesn't deserve the weight you're giving it. But fiction slips past that defense system entirely. When you watch a character, someone fictional, someone safely removed from your actual life, wrestle with an inheritance they never asked for, or a loyalty that's tearing them in two directions, or a grief so large it reshapes their whole personality, you're not defending anything, you're just watching, you're just feeling. And somewhere in that unguarded state, the recognition sneaks in sideways. Oh, that's me. That's exactly what this feels like for me too. That's the real mechanism behind why a book about a Miami drug empire could teach a woman with no connection to organized crime whatsoever something true about her own family fracture. It's not about the specifics, the cocaine, the port, the contract killings, the criminal hierarchy. Those are just the vivid high-stakes container the emotional truths get poured into. Strip away the container, and what's left is achingly familiar to almost anyone who's ever inherited a wound they didn't create. The child left out of the frame, the sibling who resents an outsider's arrival, the woman who confuses loyalty for love because nobody ever taught her the difference, the slow, painful work of learning that revenge and healing cannot be fed from the same plate. Good fiction, the kind that becomes a bestseller not through marketing alone, but through readers passing it hand to hand, recommending it to people they love, returning to it during hard seasons of their own lives, does this on purpose, whether consciously or not. It builds an extreme, dramatized world, specifically so the emotional truths inside it can be examined without the reader's defenses ever fully engaging. By the time you realize you're not just reading a story about a fictional cartel, you're reading a story about yourself. It's too late to look away. You're already in it. You're already changed by it. What I'd say to someone standing where I stood. If you're reading this, and some part of it landed somewhere specific and quiet in your chest, if you've ever inherited a wound you didn't create, or spent years building walls instead of learning where your boundaries actually belong, or confused intensity for intimacy, because intensity was the only language of connection you ever saw modeled. I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me before that Tuesday phone call rearranged my whole understanding of where I came from. The legacy you inherit is not the same as the person you become. You do not get to choose what's handed to you, the absence, the secret, the fractured family, the years of silence. But you get to choose, moment by moment, decision by decision, relationship by relationship, what you build from it. That choice is the only real power available to any of us who've ever stood in the wreckage of someone else's decisions, wondering how we ended up holding the pieces. And the boundaries you never learned as a child are not gone forever. They're just late. You can learn them now, clumsily, imperfectly, with plenty of relationships that don't survive the learning curve, but you can learn them. You can learn the difference between loyalty you actually owe someone and loyalty that fear has convinced you to hand over. You can learn that revenge and healing cannot be fed from the same plate, and that eventually you have to choose which one. Examine the much quieter, much less cinematic version of the same struggle happening inside my own ordinary life. Fiction has this strange, specific power. It shows you the shape of your own wound from a safe enough distance that you can actually look directly at it instead of flinching away, the way you might if someone asked you to examine it head-on in your own unfiltered story. Why stories like this work on us. I've thought a lot since finishing that saga about why fiction, especially fiction, this dramatic, this high stakes, this far removed from my actual daily life, managed to unlock something that months of direct reflection hadn't touched. I think it's because pain examined directly is almost unbearable. When you sit down and try to think, clearly and rationally, about your own worst wound, the absent parent, the family that fractured before you even understood what was breaking, the years spent building walls instead of learning boundaries, your brain does everything it can to protect you from actually looking at it. You minimize. You rationalize. You tell yourself it wasn't that bad, or that you should be over it by now, or that other people have it so much worse that your pain doesn't deserve the weight you're giving it. But fiction slips past that defense system entirely. When you watch a character, someone fictional, someone safely removed from your actual life, wrestle with an inheritance they never asked for, or a loyalty that's tearing them in two directions, or a grief so large it reshapes their whole personality, you're not defending anything. You're just watching. You're just feeling. And somewhere in that unguarded state, the recognition sneaks in sideways. Oh, but something in her voice stopped me from dismissing it outright, a certain steadiness. The way she said it, like she'd recommended this same series to other people sitting in the same chair, wrestling with the same particular ache. So I wrote down the title on the back of a receipt I found in my bag, mostly to be polite, mostly because it felt easier to nod and take the recommendation than to keep talking about my own life for one more minute. I didn't open the first book for almost 3 weeks. It sat on my nightstand, spine uncracked, buried eventually under a coffee mug and a phone charger, the way good intentions do when they don't have any urgency attached to them. But there's a specific kind of insomnia that comes with grief. Not the kind where you can't fall asleep, but the kind where you fall asleep fine, and then wake up at 3:14 a.m. with your heart already racing, already mid-argument with someone who isn't in the room. On one of those nights, unable to go back to sleep and unwilling to keep scrolling through my phone in the dark, I picked up the book simply because it was closer than the remote. A different family, a familiar ache. The story centered on the Callaway family, a shipping and logistics dynasty out of Savannah, Georgia, built across 3 generations on the back of a river port empire that had, over the decades, quietly diversified into territory far less legal than cargo manifests and freight contracts. The patriarch, Elias Callaway, had died in the opening pages exactly the way my own father had died in my life, abruptly, from a distance, leaving behind far more questions than answers, and a family completely unprepared for what his death would unearth. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to just recount plot for the sake of recounting plot. What mattered to me, what kept me awake reading until sunlight started leaking through my blinds, wasn't the mechanics of the story. It was the ache underneath it. It was watching Vivian Callaway, sitting rigid in her father's study while a lawyer read the will aloud, discover that the man she'd called Daddy, her whole life had a second life, running parallel to hers, one she'd never been permitted to see. It was watching her 2 half-brothers, Marcus and Demond, twins who had grown up believing they understood their father completely, come to learn that the empire they were about to inherit was riddled with debts and alliances and enemies neither of them had been prepared for. But it was the fourth sibling, the one nobody in that room expected, who undid me completely. Her name was Josephine. In the book, she shows up almost 100 pages in, summoned by the same kind of impersonal, procedural phone call that had rearranged my own life. She'd grown up 2 states away, raised by a mother who never spoke her father's name, carrying the same manufactured mythology I'd built for myself as a child, the absent father reimagined as something bearable, something that didn't indict her own worth. When Josephine walked into that Savannah law office for the first time, when she sat across from siblings who looked at her like an intruder in a story that was supposedly already fully cast, I had to put the book down and just breathe for a minute, because it felt less like reading and more like being seen by someone who had never met me. I don't think the author intended the book as therapy. I don't think anyone sets out writing a multi-generational crime saga hoping it will function as a mirror for grieving daughters of absent fathers. But stories do things their authors don't always intend, and this one did something to me that 3 years of half-hearted journaling and 2 different self-help books had failed to do. It gave me language. Josephine, in the book, has a scene maybe 2/3 of the way through the first novel where she finally confronts her father's oldest business partner, a man named Cornelius, who had known Elias for 40 years and had been present for every decision Elias made about which children to acknowledge and which to hide. She asks him, flatly, without performing anger for his benefit, "Was I an accident, or was I a decision?" I had never once, in 17 years of half-formed grief, thought to ask that question about my own father. Was I an accident, or was I a decision? Was his absence a failure of circumstance, or was it an active, ongoing choice he made every single day he didn't call? The book didn't answer that question for Josephine. Cleanly. Cornelius gives her a long, evasive non-answer about complicated men and complicated legacies that made me want to throw the book across the room on her behalf. But the act of watching her ask it, watching her demand that specificity instead of accepting the soft focus ambiguity everyone kept offering her, cracked something open in me. I started asking my own version of that question. Not out loud, not yet, but internally, in the shower, in the car, in the grocery store line. Was I a decision? And slowly, uncomfortably, I started to realize that the answer didn't actually matter as much as I thought it did. Because either answer, accident, or decision led to the same practical truth. I was going to have to build my sense of worth without his input, because he was never going to be in a position to supply it. He died before I ever got the chance to ask him directly, and even if he'd lived, I had no evidence he would have answered honestly. What the twins taught me about rage. If Josephine's arc taught me about grief, Marcus and Demon's arc taught me about rage specifically. The kind of rage that curdles into something toxic when it doesn't have anywhere legitimate to go. In the book, Marcus responds to Josephine's arrival with an icy, controlled hostility that masquerades as reasonableness. He's the brother who says all the right things in front of the lawyers. Of course we want to include her. Of course this is complicated for everyone. While quietly working behind the scenes to make sure she inherits as little practical power in the business as possible. Demon, by contrast, responds with open, volatile anger, screaming at their father's memory in a scene set on the docks at midnight, asking a dead man questions a dead man can't answer, which is its own kind of tragedy rage with nowhere to land, boomeranging back at whoever's closest. I recognized both of those brothers in myself. I'd been Marcus falsely composed, saying the reasonable thing in therapy sessions and family group texts while quietly building walls nobody could see. And I'd been Demon screaming, metaphorically, at a man who couldn't hear me, taking my anger out sideways on people who had nothing to do with my father's choices. My ex-boyfriend, the one I broke up with rather than let him meet my newly discovered family, had absorbed a version of Demon's dockside rage without ever understanding why. I'd never once explained to him that my coldness wasn't about him. It was about protecting myself from a vulnerability I didn't know how to name. Watching 2 fictional brothers destroy their relationship with each other over an inheritance neither of them asked for watching them choose competition over honesty, because it was easier than admitting how much their father's secrets had hurt them both, gave me a kind of horrified clarity about my own patterns. I didn't want to become Marcus, performing wellness while quietly punishing people. I didn't want to become demoned, screaming into a void that couldn't scream back. I wanted badly to become something the book hadn't fully modeled yet, someone who could hold grief and rage simultaneously, without letting either one calcify into a permanent personality. What I actually did with it. I wish I could tell you that reading a boundary-setting scene in a piece of fiction instantly rewired 27 years of avoidant, all-or-nothing relational patterns. It didn't. Healing doesn't work that fast, and any essay that tells you it does is lying to you for the sake of a tidier ending. What actually happened was slower and clumsier. I brought the "I'm not the one you're angry at" line into my next therapy session, half embarrassed that a piece of genre fiction had cracked something open that months of processing hadn't. My therapist didn't laugh at me. She leaned forward, actually, and asked me to say the sentence out loud, directed at an empty chair where I imagined my father might sit if he were still alive to sit anywhere. I felt ridiculous. I said it anyway. My voice cracked on the word angry, which surprised me, because I hadn't expected there to be anything left in me that hadn't already been cried out over the preceding year. We started building from there, not a script exactly, but a set of tools. I practiced saying out loud, in the safety of that office, sentences I'd never once permitted myself to say to the people who actually deserved to hear them. I need you to slow down before you tell me things like this. I'm not able to explain my whole family history in one conversation, and that's not a rejection of you. I need space right now, and I will come back to this conversation when I'm not this raw. I called my mother, eventually months later, after a lot more practicing, and I told her, calmly, without the explosion I'd always assumed would accompany that particular conversation, that I understood why she'd kept the secret, and that understanding didn't mean I wasn't still angry, and both of those things were allowed to be true simultaneously. She cried. I didn't, which surprised me more than anything else that year. I'd expected to be the one who fell apart. I found the ex-boyfriend on social media exactly once during this period, scrolled through a few photos, and then closed the app without messaging him, which felt like its own small, quiet victory. Not because reconnecting would have been wrong, but because I recognized, for the first time, that the impulse to reach out wasn't really about him. It was about testing whether I could tolerate exposure now that I understood myself better. I didn't need him to answer that question for me anymore. Meeting my half-siblings on purpose. The real test came almost a year after that first phone call, when I reached out deliberately, this time not through a lawyer's intermediary, to the two brothers I'd met exactly once, in a lawyer's office under the worst possible circumstances. I didn't reach out because the book told me to. I reached out because I'd finally built enough internal steadiness to survive the possibility of rejection, which is a very different thing than reaching out because you're desperate for anyone to fill a father-shaped hole. The older brother didn't respond for 6 weeks. When he finally did, it was a short, guarded email, the kind you write when you're testing whether someone is safe before you commit to anything warmer. The younger brother responded within a day, apologetic and overwhelmed, admitting he'd thought about reaching out to me first, but hadn't known what to say. We've since had exactly 4 phone calls, 2 of which ended in both of us needing to hang up and process alone for a while, and 2 of which ended with something that resembled, tentatively, the beginning of an actual relationship. I don't know yet what we'll become to each other. Maybe not much. Maybe, over years, something real. I've stopped needing to know in advance, which is its own kind of growth I wouldn't have predicted a year ago. Josephine, in the books, eventually reconciles with Marcus and remains permanently estranged from Desmond, and I remember being frustrated by that ending the first time I read it, wanting a cleaner resolution, wanting all 3 siblings folded neatly back together. But rereading it later, I understood what the author was actually saying. Healing doesn't require universal reconciliation. It requires you to become someone capable of reconciliation where it's possible, and at peace with its absence where it isn't. What the empire actually was. Here's the thing I didn't expect to understand until I'd lived with this story for the better part of a year. The empire, in both Josephine's story and mine, was never really the point. The shipping company, the contested inheritance, the frozen assets and legal maneuvering, all of that was scaffolding, structure to hang the real story on. The actual empire, the one that mattered, was the architecture of silence itself. The elaborate, load-bearing system of secrets a parent builds to keep two lives from touching each other, and the wreckage left behind for the children who never agreed to live inside that architecture. I inherited that empire the way Josephine did, not as wealth, not as power, but as a set of questions with no clean answers, a family I hadn't chosen, and a grief that didn't match the shape of any grief I'd been taught to expect. Nobody sits you down and teaches you how to mourn a father who was, functionally, two different people, one who existed and one who didn't, one you can point to in a photograph, and one who lived only in the space where his absence should have been. What the book gave me, ultimately, wasn't closure. Fiction rarely gives you that, not honestly. What it gave me was vocabulary. It gave me Josephine's question to Cornelius: was I an accident? Or was I a decision, even though I never got a real answer to my own version of it? It gave me a mirror, sturdy enough to look into without flinching, populated by people who didn't exist, dealing with a version of my exact wreckage, dressed up in someone else's name and someone else's coastline. The silence now, I still think sometimes about that specific silence, the one that lives in the seconds after a phone call ends, after your whole understanding of your life gets rearranged. I don't think it ever fully closes over. I think you just get better at sitting inside it without letting it define every relationship that comes after. These days, when the silence shows up, and it still does, on anniversaries, on Father's Days, in the particular hush that follows any conversation about family, I don't reach for a drink to blur its edges anymore. I reach, instead, for the sentence that started all of this: I'm not the one you're angry at. I say it to myself first, most days, before I say it to anyone else. It turns out that's usually where the sentence needs to land hardest. I didn't ask for the empire I inherited, not the real one, and not the fictional one that helped me survive it. But I built something out of both of them anyway. Not resolution, not a clean, cinematic ending, just a steadier version of myself, standing in the silence, finally able to name what I'm carrying, and finally able to put some of it down. This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental.